I was going to say that meditation is the easiest thing to do, but that's not really an accurate statement because there is no doing in meditation. There's no action or effort in meditation. It's a complete letting go of all effort, of all doing, and instead simply being. And yet, many people find meditation to be very difficult. So we're going to explore some of the reasons why it may seem difficult and see if we can find solutions. And perhaps one of the main reasons we find the practice difficult is simply that we aren't accustomed to it. Perhaps we're accustomed to always keeping busy, always doing something, or at the very least, keeping our attention occupied with some form of entertainment. I'll often hear people say that they just can't seem to sit still long enough to practice. But sitting still is usually not the issue. Most of us have no trouble at all sitting still for long periods of time. We can sit and watch a movie, or scroll through social media, or read a book. And we can sit fairly still so long as our mind is given something to do, something to entertain it, something to keep it occupied. But sitting still in a quiet space with nothing to occupy your attention, the mind can become quite restless. The mind can start nagging at you to give it something to do, or to get up and go do something. And generally we tend to just do whatever the mind wants. We give into its demands. Even though you might really want to take up this practice, the mind would rather do anything else. Mind, by its very nature, is activity, and it cannot stand silence or stillness. And so it begins to nag at you, saying, "This is boring, let's go do something." And like a child tugging at your sleeve, it can sometimes be relentless. And one of the things many people say is that they can't seem to make their minds still. They can't seem to get their minds to shut up. And there's this common misconception that meditation is about silencing the mind through some kind of force or effort. And if you try to silence your mind, you'll find it frustratingly impossible. I remember when I first took up this practice, one of the very first things I noticed was that my mind was very active, very noisy. And initially it seemed that the noise and activity would increase when I would sit to meditate. But what I eventually came to realize was that it was always that noisy. I just hadn't noticed before. I hadn't sat still long enough to become aware of just how noisy my mind was. And perhaps it appeared to be noisier given the contrast of just sitting in a quiet space doing nothing. But I found it really frustrating that my mind was not seeming to cooperate, that it would not be silent. Like many people, I had a lot of preconceived ideas and expectations about meditation. We hear all sorts of things about what others experience during meditation or as a result of the practice, such as entering into a state of deep peace and relaxation, or into a space where the mind becomes still and silent. But what we might not consider is that these experiences tend to come as a result of consistent practice over a long period of time. Most of the things that we hear about are not usually experienced in the beginning of the practice. A lot of people approach this practice with the expectation that they're going to immediately experience these kinds of things. And what they encounter instead is a mind that is extremely active and noisy. And they find their attention wandering in thought, perhaps even daydreaming or fantasizing, or they might be lost in some memory of the past or thinking about the future, perhaps even feeling anxious about the future. And all of that can be deeply frustrating, especially if you're expecting to just sink into a space of quiet tranquility. So I think it's important for anyone new to this practice not to have any expectations about it. Meditation has a great deal to do with simply observing whatever is occurring in the moment. And so I would advise those who are new to the practice to simply take notice of how noisy the mind can be, to observe the way in which thoughts come and go, and even to observe the tendency of the attention to get drawn into the stream of thought. One of the things that we're learning in this practice is how to allow our thoughts to come and go without engaging with them. And this doesn't tend to happen right away. This is why we call it a practice. Practice means doing something over and over again. It implies that when you start out, you're not going to be very skilled at it. But with patience and repetition, we get better at it. So when people say, I tried meditation, but I just wasn't very good at it, well, you could say the same thing in regard to anything you're not accustomed to doing. Most things that are new to you, you tend not to be very good at simply because you're not accustomed to it. But if you practice, you become accustomed to it. With practice, it becomes more natural. It's simply our habit to engage in thinking. And it's a very unconscious habit. In fact, it's so habitual that it might seem as if it couldn't be otherwise. But this is where observation comes in. When we sit down to practice, we may initially turn our attention to the breath. We observe the sensation of the breath, and our aim is to allow our attention to just rest on the breath. But soon our attention gets pulled into the stream of thought. And the idea here is to simply take notice of this tendency. One of the analogies that I find helpful is to think of the mind as a river and thoughts as boats passing by on the river. And the aim of meditation isn't to stop the river from flowing, nor to stop the boats from passing, but to simply remain resting on the shore. But now and again, you're going to find yourself on one of those boats being carried off down the river. And you may not even recall how you got there. It's like you just woke up to find yourself on one of these boats. And all you have to do in that moment is just step off the boat and back onto the shore. You don't have to be angry or agitated about it. You don't have to judge or condemn or punish yourself. You just notice when this happens and simply return to the shore. And this sort of thing will tend to happen over and over again. Initially, the practice isn't about remaining on the shore, but rather returning to the shore whenever you find your attention drifting away. And if you're intent on observing, you'll begin to notice as soon as you've stepped onto one of these boats, and just as quickly as you set foot on it, you can step right back off and onto the shore. As you continue in the practice, there comes a time when you'll notice yourself getting up and walking toward the river. And even before setting foot on one of these passing boats, you can just stop in that moment and sit back down. And perhaps in time, you notice just the impulse to get up, but you don't. You just remain sitting. And as for the boats, you just allow them to pass by. So it's important to understand that it's the nature of the mind to think. And we're not trying to stop that from occurring. All we're doing is learning how to disengage from the mind. And even this idea might initially seem confusing to some of us because usually we're so entangled with the mind that we mistake it to be ourselves. Meditation allows us to step back from the mind, to step back from the stream of thought, and to observe it as a separate phenomenon. In other words, to disidentify from thought, to recognize that you are not your thoughts. Rather, you are that space of awareness through which thoughts pass. The common analogy is that thoughts are like clouds and you are the sky. And the only reason we don't see that is because we've likely spent our lives in a fog. That is to say, we tend to be absorbed in thought. And it's likely going to take a bit of practice to step out of that. So we need to let go of our expectations regarding the practice. And we also need to be patient. And true patience is presence. It's not waiting for something. It's not anticipating. Because all of that involves projecting into the future. Rather, it's allowing yourself to just be right where you are in the present moment. Meditation is about being present with whatever may be occurring in the moment. So even if you sit down to practice and you're feeling restless or agitated or anxious, or whatever you may be feeling in that moment, the aim is to just be with it, whatever it happens to be. Not to resist it, not to try and get rid of it, but to just allow it to be there, and at the same time to take a step back from it and just observe. Sometimes we might feel restless when we sit down to meditate. And that restlessness could be due to any number of things. It could be due to simply being in the habit of always doing something, always keeping busy, never really allowing ourselves to rest fully and deeply. When we feel restless, our tendency is to go do something, to find some activity to engage in. But restlessness literally means to be without rest. So when we feel restless, what we're truly in need of is rest. And so the question is, can you simply allow yourself to rest? And again, we're talking about a practice, which is to say that we might find it challenging at first. We might even find ourselves giving in to the impulse to get up and go do something else. We might find that we tend not to sit for more than a couple of minutes, if even that. And that's okay. We don't need to be hard on ourselves. We need to be patient, not just with the practice, but also with ourselves, and to understand that we're just not accustomed to the practice, and that's okay. But we also have to understand that you won't become accustomed to it by giving up. You become accustomed to it by continuing to practice. And if you practice consistently, you will find that it becomes much easier in time. Once you learn to really let go and just rest fully in the moment, you'll discover that there is a deep peace within you that is deeply fulfilling. And once you've tasted that, you'll enjoy meditation. But in the beginning, it can seem very challenging. It can seem very difficult. And really it isn't, because meditation is passive. It's not something you do. It doesn't require any effort to meditate. It's a letting go of all effort, letting go of doing and simply being. So the difficulty is just that the mind would rather be entertained or occupied with something. And so the challenge is to just sit and do nothing, despite the mind nagging at you to get up and go do something. We spend a great deal of our time engaged in various activities. trying to keep ourselves busy or entertained, seeking to indulge in various pleasures and so on. And it's possible that the reason we do this is that we're looking to be distracted. You see, everyone experiences unhappiness in life. We all experience various kinds of emotional agitation or suffering in the form of anger, anxiety, grief, sadness, loneliness, and so on. And we don't want to experience these feelings. And so we look for all sorts of ways to distract ourselves. But when you sit down to meditate, there's nothing to distract you from your own thoughts and emotions. And it could be at times that this is what we're avoiding. It's not uncommon for many people that when they take up this practice, there are certain emotions that arise which can be very uncomfortable. At the very least, there may be some vague sense of unease. There may be emotions that we've been avoiding or even repressing. And it's easy when we have so many things to distract us. But when there's nothing to distract us, we're left to feel them. And maybe we don't want to feel them. Maybe that's why we feel so restless when we're sitting in silence. What might initially feel like restlessness could actually be avoidance. This feeling that we need to get up and go do something could be our sense that there's something uncomfortable here that's coming up, something that we've done well to avoid, but now there's nothing to distract us from it. And so if we want to continue to avoid it, we'd better get up and go find something to do. But there's an opportunity here to face it. There's an opportunity to work to resolve it. We have this opportunity to get curious about it, to sit with that discomfort and explore it, to ask ourselves, what is this discomfort? What is this restlessness? Now, in meditation, the aim is to just allow whatever is there to be there without engaging, whether we're talking about thoughts or feelings. The aim is to just remain in a space of passive observation, and to allow these things to come and go on their own. And sometimes it's enough to just sit with the feeling of restlessness and to relax into it. If you can just allow yourself to rest, the restlessness might go all on its own. But sometimes the restlessness can seem very intense and persistent because it's not just a feeling of restlessness. Just beneath it, there may be some unsettling emotion. There may be some unresolved anger or anxiety or sadness. But I would challenge you to just sit and allow it to come up and to acknowledge it, whatever it happens to be, because avoiding it isn't going to resolve it. If we're just avoiding it, it will simply remain in us, and eventually we will come to face it at some point. These things have a way of rising to the surface and finding expression. And the reason is because they want to be resolved. So if that's the case, if that's what we're dealing with, if during our practice there are these unresolved emotions rising up, this is something that we need to give our attention to so that we can work to resolve them. And this is something in addition to meditation. Working with our emotions, exploring them, and so on, that's a different kind of practice. But it may be that when these things come up during our meditation practice, we need to allow them space to come up. That's part of how our emotions get processed. One of the reasons we get stuck with unresolved emotions is because we don't allow them to be processed. So sometimes you may need to put aside the practice and just take some time to process your emotions. And it may be helpful in some cases to acquire the assistance of a therapist. Sometimes it's very helpful to have someone guide you through the process. Sometimes you may be dealing with some deep emotional trauma, and a good therapist can help you to work through that in order to resolve it. Now, none of this is to suggest that we should give up the practice. Meditation can be immensely helpful in working with difficult emotions, because meditation is about learning how to make space for these things, to sit back and observe our thoughts and emotions. And that can be extremely helpful, because typically when we experience some unpleasant emotion, we tend to find ourselves right in the midst of it, in a fog, so to speak. And meditation helps us to step out of that fog, to take a step back, so that rather than being consumed by the emotion, we come to recognize that the emotion is something occurring within us. We come to recognize that emotions are just one of many phenomena occurring within the space of awareness. And so when we learn to make space for our emotions, we don't tend to feel so overwhelmed by them. We can be aware of them. We can observe and examine them without being consumed by them. So whether we're dealing with a general sense of restlessness, or whether there is some uncomfortable emotion arising, whatever the feeling happens to be, can we make space for it? Can we observe the feeling without getting wrapped up in the thoughts which might accompany it? To just observe the sensation of it in the body. Because just the sensation of it is usually not unpleasant. It's just a sensation. It's the thoughts in the mind that are the source of our suffering. And if we can just give our full attention just to the sensation, then the feeling tends to settle. If we can just sit with the feeling of restlessness and relax into that space, the restlessness will tend to dissolve. If we can allow ourselves to simply rest rather than giving into the impulse to go and do something, we may discover that this is really what we've been needing. Maybe our life is so active, so hectic, so busy that we just need some time to rest and relax. But whatever the case, whatever it may be that seems challenging about the practice, there are a number of things that we can do to make the practice easier. And I'm not going to go into all of that right now. I think this video has gone on long enough, but I will make another video offering a few additional things that we can try. In the meantime, don't be hard on yourself. Be gentle. Be patient. Be kind.